My name is Brendan Hannafin. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'll hopefully help you get your questions to Julie as she goes. Again, please make sure you're muted. And also, this is taped, so please are recorded, I guess. So taped, showing my age. Excuse me. Yeah, just be aware that you can watch it later and type any questions you have into the box, and I'll try to get to them. I want to introduce Julie Flanagan. I've known Julie for the 21 years I've worked in the county, so an amazing resource. She has over 30 years of experience in the field of urban forestry, first in Fairfax County, and for the last 22 years, Prince William County. So, Julie, I guess we came on about the same time.
Yeah, we did.
She holds a bachelor's of science degree in forestry and wildlife management from Virginia Tech. Go Hokies. She has successfully identified, planned, and implemented 18 reforestation projects, returning native forests to over 75 acres of public and HOA land in Prince William County. We've gotten the chance to work together on a couple of those projects, and hopefully we have a couple more coming up. She loves restoring the land to its forest, is one of your favorite aspects of her work. So with that, Julie, I'll take it away.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And there we go. Push everybody off to the side. Do you all see my everybody's pictures off to the right? Because I don't want that to block the screen.
Yeah, Julie, it's fine. We can see the screen.
Okay.
Julie, change your view to presenter mode or the speaker view.
Speaker view to presenter mode.
Where you see everybody's pictures in blocks up at the top. There's a view in the black. Change it to speaker view instead of gallery view. That way when it records, it only shows you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Because I'll be talking. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to Trees, Reestablishing the Cornerstone of Our Ecosystem. I am Julie Flanagan, the Prince William County arborist, and it's really good to have such a wonderful crowd of people here today. And we're going to focus specifically on trees and forests. So here's what we're going to cover today, as soon as this allows me to do what Alonzo, okay, I'm going to stop sharing and try again, because that did not allow me to move the screen. There we go. Okay. Here's our general outline. We're going to cover the composition of a forest, why trees are the cornerstone of our ecosystem, tree planting and reforestation, practical tips, making the most of your investment, and then resources to help you plan and plant. So before I get into that outline, I'm just going to pause and say these are two, a lot of people have questions about what can we put in our yard. My presentation is not going to go into specifics for what tree would work well in your yard. It's more of a broad view of the why and some ideas for that you might be able to implement on your own property or in your neighborhood. So what I want to do right up front is give you a couple of resources here, and this slide will be on at the end as well. Of two resources I find really helpful that you can download for free online. One is Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping. That covers the entire Chesapeake Bay region. Some of those may not actually be native to our area because that guide does go up into Pennsylvania and parts of New York, which might not be appropriate, might have some species in there that wouldn't be appropriate for us here. But generally, very good guide, very thorough. And then Native Plants for Northern Virginia. That's this guy down here. And that one is only for the Northern Virginia region. It has several pictures in it to help you get an idea what the plants look like. And then toward the end, it has a rather thorough list of all different kinds of plants for our area. Online resources, I love the USDA plants database because when you know the species you're interested in, you can go there, put it in as a search, and it'll specifically tell you that whether or not, it would give you a map that shows you whether or not that plant has been documented as occurring in our area. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center includes only native wildflowers, and so they're a good resource. And then Plant Nova Natives is a fantastic local resource for all different kinds of information on choosing species, finding a nursery, getting a designer, all sorts of stuff. More programs that you can sign up. If this one is wet your whistle, you'll have a lot of opportunities to go to future programs that can help you learn even more. Okay, now I'm not, all right, I guess I got to click on the screen. So Virginia wants to be a forest. We live in the eastern deciduous forest, and that's an area that's dominated by broadleaf deciduous trees, and that means that deciduous means that they're going to lose their leaves every year in the fall and go into a dormant period through the winter. That we're in a deciduous forest does not mean there are not evergreen trees or even forests that are composed almost exclusively of evergreen trees. But it does mean that across the eastern United States, and particularly in our area, the deciduous forest is what tends to dominate. There are 5 basic layers to a healthy forest. There's the overstory, the understory, the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, and the leaf litter layer. And we're going to go into each of these in a bit more detail. Let's start with the overstory. Start at the top and work our way down. This is the highest level of foliage. It's this carpet that you see across the mountains in the image in front of you. It forms a continuous canopy, or usually a continuous canopy of leaves. Put you up there. Almost a continuous canopy of leaves. The species composition can change of that forest canopy, and that is dependent upon the site conditions and the successional stage. So if you're in had an old field that's been left fallow, and now that field is being allowed to convert into forest, the composition of the species that make up that old field will be very different from if you were to come back to that same old field 80 to 100 years later. You might see something that's really more in the lines of a mature, what would be called a climax forest, which is a very stable forest, a kind of forest that's able to replicate itself and keep itself in existence, and there wouldn't be some other stage of forest to replace it. The upper canopy produces vast amounts of food for herbivores. And that is where you've heard a lot today about the connection between native plants and different kinds of wildlife, particularly insects. And that connection is most effectively done. That connection is related to leaves, and that connection is most obvious when you've got a huge canopy like this with billions and trillions and quadrillions of leaves available for herbivores to consume. The overstory exerts a great deal of influence over all of the life that lives below it. And we'll look at that in just a minute. So here are some of the main species of overstory trees, the trees that make it really tall and form that canopy, and which you can see right away in the parentheses are the number of species of within that genera. So oak is a genera, pine is a genera, ash is a genera, and within that you have a number of species that occur there. And you can see from that that the oak genera has the most number of species in our area. So oaks truly do dominate. But we also have many other species of trees that are dominant and are commonplace. Tulip poplar you're probably familiar with, black cherry, and perhaps some that you might not be as familiar with, like common hackberry, which is a wonderful, produces a lot of wonderful fruits for birds. Underneath the overstory, we have the understory. These are trees that are smaller in nature by nature. They are never going to be a really large tree. Think of something like flowering dogwood or a serviceberry or a common redbud. And those are going to compose that understory layer. But the understory is also going to contain the younger versions of the overstory species. So young American beech, young oaks, young hickories. And they're just waiting there for their opportunity to get more sunlight and burst through that understory layer and try to become a member of the overstory layer. The understory layer is also a really important nesting area for many bird species. And in the lower left here, you see a nest of a blue-gray gnatcatcher That's his tail sticking up there, and probably her tail sticking up there. And then two of her wings just making over the edge. She forms her nest from, coats the outside of it, sticks on there a lot of lichen, which are these light colored areas, and uses spider webs and things like that to make a very elastic and pretty much waterproof nest. She lives in the understory. Here's some understory species. American holly, which is one of our most wonderful evergreen trees. Eastern redbud, ironwood, flowering dogwood, serviceberry, black gum, pawpaw, hornbeam, sassafras, and there's actually many more. These are just a few pictures to give you an idea of how beautiful some of these understory trees are. Some of them, their beauty is more subtle, like the pawpaw with this really beautiful maroon and green flower in the early spring. And the sassafras, I just want to mention this one because you might think that's the fall color of the sassafras. I mean, in fact, that picture was taken in early spring as the young sassafras leaves were emerging from their buds. So a lot of different seasons of interest with a lot of these plants. Now we're going to drop down to the shrub layer. The shrub layer basically occurs from ground level to about 10 or 15 feet above the ground. Like the understory, it is also very important breeding habitat for a large variety of birds. I'm just listing a few here with the American redstart, the wood thrush, and the ruby-throated hummingbird. But there's so many more that are breeders in the shrub layer. Now, one of the things about the shrub layer you want to keep in mind if you want to put a shrub layer on your property is that it's because of its height, it's very subject to being overbrowsed by deer populations and heavy deer populations. And in fact, if you own a woodland, you may find that the shrub layer may be largely missing because of deer browse. So definitely one thing you can do is reintroduce those shrubs, but you're probably going to need to protect them until they can get tall enough to be above the deer browse height. Here's some common shrub species. There's tons of them, and many of them are very beautiful. We have several viburnum. We have native azaleas. Winterberry holly, you've probably heard mentioned a few times because of its absolutely gorgeous winter berries. The low bush and high bush blueberry, if you want to plant something that you might actually enjoy the fruit of yourself. We do have rhododendron, although they are rare and very specialized in their habitat. Mountain laurel, hazelnut, blatternut, spicebush, there's just lots of them. And you can see from these that you can get beautiful fall color from them, like the black chokeberry, along with very interesting fruits. This is the pinkster azalea, and there's some blueberries. And one of my favorites, this is Chionanthus virginicus, which is the white fringe tree, and that is it in full bloom, absolutely stunning. So down now to the herbaceous layer. And this is also what most of us would know as the wildflower layer. In Virginia, in our deciduous forest, we have gorgeous wildflowers. And here's just a few of them you might find in a forest near you. Showy orchis, wood betony, bloodroot, one of my favorites. I have it in my backyard. Foam flower, very delicate. Yellow lady slippers, Solomon seal, large flowered trillium, mayapple and Dutchman's breeches. Mayapple is that wide four-parted, five-parted flower or leaf there, and Dutchman's breeches are those look like little white pantaloons hanging from a clothesline. And then toadshade, one of our native trilliums, another of our native trilliums. And then last but not least, everybody's probably familiar with Virginia bluebells. If you're not, there's a Bluebell Festival when we're able to all meet again in April every year, sponsored by our Prince William Conservation Alliance. And this is what you can see when you go to the Bluebell Festival. Good news about bluebells, they love floodplains, but they don't only love floodplains. They actually can do very well in a garden soil, given light shade and decent moisture. The leaf litter layer, this is the layer that most people just sort of either don't appreciate or they don't even think about the value of it. It is the layer where you'll find fungi, bacteria, protozoa, all sorts of microorganisms and some very small macroorganisms like the worms and insect larvae that live in that leaf litter layer. That leaf litter layer promotes the best health for your woody plants. It helps keep the soil moist during drought periods. It is a primary way which nutrient cycling takes place in the soil, and without that, you get a depleted soil. And it hosts symbiotic relationships that many plants are very dependent upon. It's also the habitat for a lot of ground feeders, ground nesters, and ground hibernators. So oftentimes birds will nest, or we have several bird species that do nest on the ground itself. They will not be nesting on a lawn. They will be looking for a leaf litter layer like they find in a forest floor. And the birds you see here are ground nesters. But also there can be turtles which will hibernate, and the same with salamanders, which will actually burrow down into a leafy layer of the forest soil and hibernate over winter. So that layer is something I can't emphasize enough. If you don't have that around your trees and you can recreate it, do so. All right, so how do trees form the cornerstone of our ecology? Well, trees grow in communities that we call forests. And when they grow in those communities, they affect and alter numerous environmental factors, creating and sustaining intricate and diverse communities of other life forms. So when you have that canopy of that tree, the shade that it creates has a dramatic effect on all the life below it. And all the life below it is adapted to living under the shade of those trees. So that shade is a really key feature in what kind of ecosystem, what kind of plant communities you have underneath there. That shade creates cooler temperatures, and that affects what plants can grow. There's organic matter because the leaves drop, they go to the ground, they add organic to within the soil and then on the top layer. There's a greater retention of soil moisture that we mentioned earlier, and that fosters a very healthy microbial life in the soil, which is extremely important for the overall health of all the plants that live in that environment. And then the seasonal sunlight variations from a deciduous tree, a canopy where the leaves have dropped in the fall and you have more sunlight in the winter and early spring. There are some species of plants that are dependent upon that the losing of those leaves, and they take advantage of that early spring environment where there's no canopy, no shade, but there's warm enough temperatures that they venture out from the soil and try to get their most important parts of their life cycle in while the leaves are off the trees. And of course, if you have an evergreen canopy, then you have shade year round. And that is something else that will create a different set of plant communities because of that year round shade. Okay, so how trees form the cornerstone? Well, they create the environment that produces our healthiest streams. And they do this in many ways. First, they drop their leaves. So organic matter falls into the stream. That organic matter is the foundation of the food web within that stream system. The smallest of the creatures in that stream will begin to feed on that organic matter, and then other creatures that feed on those organic, those leaf eaters will feed on them. So they're the foundation and they're a crucial part of that system. The forest root mat is this intricate, interwoven set of roots that hold the soil in place and prevent it from eroding into the soil and silting up the stream. Also, the shade keeps those streams, the water in the streams, cooler and more constant. Without the shade, there'd be big swings in the temperature of water. And those swings are very hard for aquatic organisms to deal with. Also, cooler water means higher levels of dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen is just like we have to breathe the air that's around us. Aquatic insects breathe oxygen through the water that is in the water around them. Lower levels of dissolved oxygen mean fewer aquatic insects. But shade and cools the water levels, cools the water temperature, allows more dissolved oxygen within the water and creates healthier insect populations and therefore healthier fish populations. So trees are the number one reason that neotropical migratory birds come to our region. Every year, millions and millions of birds leave their homes in South America, Central America, and the southern United States and move northward into the forests of the eastern United States and Canada. And the reason they do that is to breed here. The reason they're breeding here is because our trees support very high populations of Lepidoptera and other insects such as spiders. And these birds are going to use those insects to feed the next generation of songbirds. Trees are also very important to sustaining resident and wintering birds and mammals through supplying them with winter seeds, berries, and sap. So wild turkey will be in our forests because there are acorns that come and are in the ground, and they can harvest those during the winter. Similarly with holly berries that a lot of songbirds will eat and the like. Trees also create structures that many birds will rely upon for nesting sites and the nesting material and winter shelter. As an example, many songbirds will communally hide in a cavity of a tree in the winter and share each other's body warmth as they make it through the cold winter's night. So you may have seen this slide or something very similar to it in Alonso's talk earlier. This is the list of the 10 most valuable woody plants for supporting Lepidoptera. And you can see that oak tops the list. These are all based upon data that was accumulated in the eastern United States. So this is very applicable to our area. So all these are going to be genus that include all native plants. You can find non-natives in these genera, but stick with the natives. And you can support these types of Lepidoptera. Now we're going to look at next at, here's the number of Lepidoptera supported by perennial plants, and you'll see that the numbers drop down significantly. Now, I'm not going to tell you don't plant perennials. In fact, I'm going to tell you plant perennials, absolutely do. But realize that if you're looking for plants that will give you the biggest bang for your buck, trees are going to do that. They're going to support a higher percentage or a higher number and a higher variety of Lepidoptera. Desiree Narango is a researcher that worked with Douglas Tallamy, and she did some research into how chickadees, local chickadee populations were breeding and how successfully they were breeding based upon the amount of native plant biomass that was in a suburban yard. And what she found, I'll just go ahead and read this. This is a researcher discussing the results of her study. The researchers found that the only yards that were able to produce enough chickadees to sustain a stable population were those with a plant composition made up of more than 70% of native plants. That's key, more than 70% of native plants. Because more than 90% of the herbivorous insects will only eat one or a few native plants, the use of these plants in the landscape is essential to ensure breeding birds have enough insect prey to eat. And what he means there is that those breeding birds have enough insect prey not only to eat themselves, but to bring back to their chicks. For the same reason, native plants are also likely critical for other resident birds, endangered species, and migratory species, and not just in the backyards on the East Coast. So what Desiree found was that when that percentage of native biomass dropped below 70%, the chickadees breeding in those habitats could not produce enough young to replace the adults that would be dying off from year to year. So what can you do? Well, let's start with tree planting. And here I'm going to just talk about taking basically an individual tree and putting it into a property, not trying to recreate a forest necessarily. Tree planting may be something that will work best if you have a limited amount of space, such as if you're on a townhouse, a condo, or a village home. By village home, I mean properties that are less than 7,000 square feet in space, in acreage. There's a lot of benefits to tree planting, so don't discount this. If you can only put one tree in the ground, put it in and pick one of those native species that we looked at earlier, or native genera that we looked at earlier. You'll be getting a new canopy, which is very beneficial. If you don't have room to plant a new tree, perhaps you can replace a dead or dying tree with a native. Remember the high value of oaks. They supported the greatest number of Lepidoptera. And then if you maybe already have a tree and you're thinking about how do I improve my small property, well, you can certainly add the missing forest layers such as herbaceous plants, shrubs, and the leaf litter. So you can always do something even with a small property. Now, reforestation, and when I talk about reforestation, I'm speaking mostly about putting in the big bones, so to speak, of a forest. Put in those overstory species, the understory species, and sometimes maybe you're going to plant shrubs as well. But usually when I do a reforestation, I'm putting in the overstory species and the understory species, and then we're going to let that land go and let natural processes take place so that eventually the leaf layer will form, Eventually, you will get shrubs that will voluntarily come into that area. And although perennials is another question, which we can talk about later. Reforestation may be something you could do on a small scale if you're part of on your own property, or if you have a larger lot, or if you have HOA land that you can work with. So in the picture off to the right, we have single family homes that are next to a golf course. This is the green, that nice smooth green area there. Then there's the sand trap with the rough next to it. I don't know what they call the really rough area, but that's the really rough area. And then we get to the homes. Well, if you owned a home there, you might be able to plant some overstory and understory trees on your property, and then work with your HOA to see whether or not you could expand and do some work on that common area. Also keep in mind that whenever you have existing trees like these, the brown kind of fuzzy area there are existing mature trees. That's how they look from an aerial image. And if this person were to plant on their yard, they would be connecting to an existing wooded area. That's extremely beneficial. Build on what's already there. If you don't have anything there, start building and be the person who somebody else can build next to. Like, for example, if you could talk your neighbor into building, well, then you could create even greater habitat, and then create a neighborhood that is really thinking about how collectively they can improve the environment. Whoa, that is weird. That did not show up like it's supposed to show up. So we're going to make do, because I'm not going to take the time to change it. So this is kind of distorted, but these townhomes off on the left are a subdivision that allowed us to come onto their common area. That green outline is, I'm going to use my cursor to show you, this is the common area of this townhouse development, down in here and over in here and back up again. It was about a 4-acre common area, and it had an intermittent stream. The blue line is supposed to show you where that stream is, but I'll use my cursor. It's actually running right through here. An intermittent stream that in generally throughout most of that area, it was just lawn when we went to this HOA, and we asked them if they would partner with us to reforest that area, and they said yes. So I'm gonna pass that weird looking slide by and come to something very normal. So this is what their common area looked like before we planted. Mostly lawn, scattered mature trees, and an intermittent channel that holds water only portion of the year. In 2012, this is what it looked like. By the time we went to them and got permission from them to plant, they had it was 2013, so the first trees went in the fall of 2013. This is what it looked like in the third growing season in 2016. This is what I call the brushy weedy stage. We did work with the HOA to help them understand that this was going to be a stage that the forest would go through, and they were able to work with us and really help people understand that this was an important stage. Keep your eye on these two posts over here, because the next image is going to be show those two posts. So this is what that same reforestation looked like in its 5th growing season. And you can see that the canopies of these trees are starting to touch one another. And this is where that brushy weedy stage begins to disappear, and the area starts to look more like a true forest. Here's another example from Cloverdale Park. Not our typical reforestation, because we did have a sloughing bank here that we graded back and fixed the eroding soils there. But keep your eye on that tulip poplar. It's going to show up in other photos here. So this is what it looked like prior to planting. We did this with volunteers. In this case, our volunteers did plant some shrubs into this. We put the weed mat down to help control erosion. Not what we normally do. Normally we just use the tubes and the trees. We also killed the grass and then mulched afterwards. So here's what it looked like after planting, immediately after planting. That slope was taken care of. The tubes with the bird netting on them to keep the birds from falling down into the tubes. Here's the 2nd growing season. Again, the brushy weedy stage. Now, if you're thinking about reforesting on your land, I would encourage you to embrace the brushy weedy stage, because there's some really interesting things happening in here. Things that you don't pay for, you get free. What you get for free are fall asters. That's this white plant down here at the bottom. And here's Biden's. that voluntarily came in. We didn't plant these things at all. Cattails voluntarily came in. There'd be a lot of other forbs in this area that voluntarily come into that area. And before that area really closes its canopy, becomes a great habitat for pollinators in that sort of meadow form. And then here's what it looked like from before and then in the 13th growing season. Again, the same tulip poplar that you can see. And now you see that shade over the stream, which was basically full sun before. You see the shade. The stream even looks healthier at this point. And so I want to go over now what we're looking at planting, what you might be able to get and use to plant. We're going to go from least expensive to most expensive. Least expensive is bare root stock, which, as you might expect, you can purchase cheaply, but it comes without any soil on its roots. Because of that, it's going to be wrapped in plastic, and those roots have to be kept moist until you plant them. You can only plant them in the dormant season, and you have to be sure that you take good care of those roots so that they don't dry out before you plant them. So you need to plant them pretty quickly. Next, you have what we call tubelings. This little container here is 9 inches deep and 3 inches on each side. The tree comes with the soil that it's grown in. So when you pull the tree out of that, it's got the soil attached to the roots. And I find I have a better survival rate with these tubelings than I do with the bare root, although bare root is a good choice. Then we have gallon stock. This is gallon stock. And on 1 gallon, you get a bigger plant with that and a more expensive plant because of that. And then finally, whipstock. These are probably like, I forget, 3 or 5 gallon containers. They're called whipstock because they're grown. Most of the time when you find them, they're maybe 4, 5, 6 feet tall, but they really normally don't branch. In this case, these guys are fairly branched, but oftentimes they have no branching on them and they look like a whip. And I just love this photo because this is a family that came out and helped us do one of our plantings, and they were just a delight. So practical tips and ideas. Make sure you think about putting the right tree in the right place. One way to figure out if something's going to like the ground that you have is just see what's growing next to you. If you have woods close by, like really close by, then see what's growing there. And you can select some of those species to try in your yard. Make sure you think about the right size and shape tree for the space that you have, and consider the rooting space as well as the canopy space. This is a beautiful white oak tree. If you put this right next to your house, you might regret it after a few years because look how broadly that canopy can spread. And then don't plant trees under utility lines. The utility companies will always have the ability to come and remove those trees or hack them to pieces. They don't need to ask your permission. And if they kill them, they will not replace them. And it looks like we just got a note from Rob Johnson saying that the breakout sessions are going to go to 12:10. So good, I don't have to stop right now, but we will definitely move along. Tree roots and grass versus mulch. On the left is an image from a study that the Morton Arboretum did about a number of tree roots that grew under a mulch covering like you would buy at a home center compared to tree roots going under grass. And what they found that 10 times more tree roots would grow under mulch as under grass. So if you want to do something really immediately and cheaply to improve the health of your trees, get rid of the grass and mulch. Mulch widely, not deeply. About 3 to 4 inches of mulch is all you need, and don't put it up around the base of the tree. Volcano mulching is a bad thing. More ideas. Take a soil test. Virginia Tech Soil Lab will perform a soil test for you for $10. You can get the sample boxes from Cooperative Extension. I think some libraries will also have soil sample boxes in them, and maybe some garden centers. If you live on A1 land, agricultural land, the Soil and Water Conservation District will do a soil test for you for free. And then when you're planting, because we're in a suburban urban area, more than likely when your home was built, the topsoil and the organic matter was removed, and you were left with what are called B horizon soils. If you in the process can bring back in topsoil and bring back in that organic layer, you will benefit your trees greatly. Incorporate native berry producing trees and shrubs for fall and winter migrants and winter residents. That's something that helps you really enjoy the benefits of what you're doing year round. And this on the left is a beautiful cardinal feeding on winterberry holly. So that's a very good thing to do. And it's also a good idea, especially if you've got somebody else mowing your lawn, to define a border between the area that you want to be forest or that you're reclaiming for forest and your lawn area. I use a low ground cover like this dwarf crested iris. It took a while for me to figure out what the lawnmower guy recognized as was not grass so that he would stop mowing it. And this worked for me. Also, control invasive species early on. They're so much easier to deal with before they become a big problem. And then lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Oftentimes we may have some fears and biases that need to be overcome in order to make a forest a forest. For example, people may be afraid that if they have a brushy, weedy stage that they're going to have snakes. Well, a couple things. One, you probably have snakes already. Two, snakes eat mice, rats, and insects. So if you want something to control your mice population, snakes are just the right thing for that. And we only have one kind of snake that you actually need to be concerned about, the copperhead, as being a poisonous snake. All our other snakes are not poisonous and they're not harmful. Standing dead trees. These are great wildlife habitat, and they don't really need to scare you. If they're near your home, it's something that it could really do damage to should they fall. Yeah, take that one out. But if they're not a threat to your home or your kids' play area or where you park your car, then why not leave them stand? I had a dead ash tree in the common area behind my townhome. And when it died because of emerald ash borer, we had the tree company come out and they didn't cut it down all the way. They left about 20, 25 feet of it standing so that it could be habitat. And they are habitat for woodpeckers, wintering birds, cavity nesting birds, even dens for flying squirrels. And if you've ever seen a flying squirrel, it's adorable. And if you should happen to be so blessed as to have a great horned owl nest in one of your dead trees, well, you certainly wouldn't want to take down the habitat for that beautiful little bird. Down logs, maybe they look messy to you, but maybe we can rethink that. Down logs are actually excellent habitat. They contribute back to the topsoil, and they have all sorts of life both on top of them and within them. Pileated woodpeckers are one species of bird that spends about 40% of its time foraging for insects on the forest floors, and ants. They're big ant eaters, but they'll spend a lot of their time foraging on the ground. This one was pecking away at that piece of wood that it was sitting on. And then you can have moss and mushrooms and snails, and a down log can become a really interesting place to go and look for life. Local assistance. The Virginia Department of Forestry has regional foresters that can help you with managing an existing forest stand. And they can also, if you have enough land that you might be able to reforest for timber production, they can help you with that. The Prince William Cooperative Extension Office and has a Master Gardener Help Desk. There's their phone number. They are a great source of help. They also hold a lot of classes to help you learn more about gardening. And then the Soil and Water Conservation District has what's called a VCAP program that can help you with financial assistance for small projects in transforming part of your property into a native landscape. So that's the end of my talk. I'm going to leave this one on but I'm going to escape out of this. I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, Julie, we have a lot of questions to go through.
Let's go for it.
I'm trying to get to the beginning here. Some of them have been answered by our other participants.
We've got about 15 minutes or so.
We have some time here. What flowers and shrubs are more deer tolerant? Mary.
Yeah, for that, I usually encourage people to find a list online because I'm not going to really be able to give you a really good thorough list, but I can tell you from experience, pawpaw and American holly are two understory species that are going to be in that range where the deer can reach them. They really don't like pawpaw or American holly. I've planted other things that are supposed to be more resistant. Some of the viburnums are supposed to be more resistant. Supposedly winterberry holly is more resistant. And honestly, I think when the deer are hungry enough, they'll go ahead and eat just about anything. So what I would encourage you to do if you got a deer problem is put some sort of fencing around a plant. And if you have the type of shrub or understory, overstory tree that's going to get above the deer browse line, which is about 4 feet, 4.5 feet tall, deer really don't browse above that point. So if you can protect your plant until it gets that tall, then you can remove whatever protection you have and the plant should do all right, despite deer browse.
And Julie, I'd add to that the fact that in this area, we just have too many deer, so they are going to eat anything. I mean, they eat Atlantis if they have to.
Yeah.
So if you see misformed hollies that go about 4 foot up,
yeah,
you'll know you have way too many deer in your area.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. We know that pin oaks produce acorns.
Yes.
Do they support any insects or mammals?
Well, I don't know the specific insects that would be on the pin oak, which would probably be true for most oaks, but they would be in that whole group of oaks that have a lot of butterfly larvae that feed on them. So I'm sorry, I'm not well versed in that. That feed on the seeds, there's a lot. Fox actually will eat acorns. We mentioned wild turkey earlier. Bear will eat acorns. Gosh, there's just obviously things like squirrels, flying squirrels, although they eat more insects than seeds, but flying squirrels could be there too. So there's a lot of wildlife that will munch on acorns. They're very, they're called hard mast because they're not soft like a berry would be, like say a black cherry fruit. They're called hard mast, and there's just a ton of animals that feed on hard mast. And I'm sorry, I'm not really good at kind of, bam, I got a list in my head. Not very good at that. So sorry, I can't give you more details.
I know the deer in Montclair like the acorns as well. So
yeah.
Julie, what would you consider some fast growing trees to consider?
Faster growing trees, red maple is a fast growing tree. Red cedar is actually relatively fast growing. Willows, we have black willow is one of our native willow trees, and that's a very fast grower. Sycamore, American sycamore, tulip poplar, a fast grower. There's probably one or more I could come up with if I thought about it a little bit. River birch. River birch is a really fast grower. And it's all of these are great for bird population and lepidopter as well.
Yeah, I have a tulip poplar in my backyard, and I've been here 12 years, and seems to have doubled in size in that amount of time.
Yeah, we planted a floodplain in Ben Lomond Park, and we planted it in 2014, I believe it was, and we just went out to do some maintenance. So it's 6 growing seasons into its life. And the sycamores and the tulip poplars were 20 feet tall, 25 feet tall. You could walk underneath them. 6 years in the ground, and they were loving that area so much, you could walk without having to bend over. You could walk underneath them. Now, I'm not promising that for your property. That is highly dependent upon soils and the amount of moisture that the tree gets. So you will get, and in some of these reforestation sites, we're 12, 15 years out, and we haven't gotten canopy closure yet because the soils are very poor in those sites. So the growth of a tree, the speed of a tree's growth is very closely tied to the quality of the soil that it's in.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Trees, Tree of Heaven, autumn olive, and Bradford pears are non-native. Any suggestions to manage?
I think it depends on how big the tree is. If you don't want to use an herbicide and the tree's relatively small, one of the things you can do is simply cut it down. It will have energy in its root system, and it'll grow back. If you let it grow for a little while, and then partway through the growing season, you go back and cut it again. You may have to do that 2 or 3 times to deplete the energy in the roots, but you can kill a tree simply by going repeatedly and killing it, and letting it grow up for maybe a month or 2, and then cutting it down again, let it grow, cut it down again. And eventually you'll deplete the energy in the tree's root system. and it will die. If the tree's bigger, one of the things you can do, say like maybe it's 10 inches in diameter or something like that, you can girdle girdle the trunk of the tree by taking something like an axe and cut off all the bark for maybe a 2-foot length around the entire circumference of the tree, get down into the sapwood of the tree that carries the water. And what you're doing is separating the energy source and the leaves from one of the major storage places in the roots. And eventually that tree is going to starve because it can't get the energy from the leaves down into the roots.
Okay, 9 large oaks in my yard. This is from Lanny. 9 large oaks in my yard have died from oak wilt in the last 8 years. I'm hesitant to replace them with oak trees as long as oak wilt is a problem. Any hope for a prevention or cure? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we arborists yet fully understand oak wilt. It's something that's become an increasing problem within the last decade or so. And it does hit, for those who are unfamiliar, if you've been noticing really mature oak trees relatively quickly dying, it's from oak wilt. We think it is caused by a brown algae that is in the soil, and on really wet years, really wet growing seasons, that algae has the ability to work its way up into the stem and the system of the tree. And then it can dry out and clog the tissue that carry water up from the roots into the canopy of the tree. And we don't have a cure for that algae yet, that brown algae. We don't have a treatment for that brown algae. I don't know that I would not plant an oak because it does seem to affect really mature oaks and not so much younger oaks. So you might want to plant and just in the hope that there will be some sort of treatment for that, 10 years from now. But you can certainly go with other native trees that hickories, hackberries, all sorts of things that you could do as a substitute. But I think we're still at least a few years out from understanding exactly what's happening, and then we have to understand what's happening before we can find a cure for it.
This is from Carol. Do you get resistance from homeowners about the thicket of shrubs and trees that filled in after the first several years of the project reforestation? What feedback did you get about the density of plant fill?
We use when we're doing reforestation, we plant usually seedlings. They're usually about 12 to 18 inches in height. We plant at a density of 450 trees per acre. Some people will plant as low as 250 trees per acre. But when we do that, we're also using protective tubes to keep the deer safe from deer browse. If we plant without protective tubes, we bump up our density to 650 trees per acre because we figure we will lose some of those because of deer browse. And so we're just basically kind of trying to give the deer more than they can possibly eat. Do we receive resistance? Yes, that is probably the biggest thing I do if I'm working with an HOA and we want to plant on them. We have talks about this is how it's going to, and I presume, Carol, you're saying, that brushy, weedy stage, or maybe it's just so thick that they feel like they can't get into it, and maybe some, criminals hiding in there.
Yeah, the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional, when they do trainings, they actually are discouraging people from planting thick areas because they're getting pushback from people. And I just wondered if, from an ecological standpoint, it's certainly wonderful habitat. But from the homeowner standpoint, I just was curious how you navigate that.
Mostly education. We don't, well, the townhouse, the distorted townhouse picture that you saw was that community actually ripped out, the area we planted had a tot lot in it. That before we got there, the community ripped that out because they had drug dealers hanging out in the tot lot selling drugs. And when we brought to them the idea of reforesting this, they actually liked it because they thought it would be discouraging to people who wouldn't want to get in a tangle of a thicket to go and sell drugs. Now, that may be true, it may be not true, but they actually looked at it. They didn't have a tangle of a thicket. and they were having drug problems. They had a wide open area and they were having drug problems. So to my knowledge, so far, there's been no problems on that property with any new drug issues, to the best of my knowledge. But we do a lot of education ahead of time, talking about how this is going to be dense. And we try to explain to them the ecological reasons for letting it be dense. And so far, I really haven't had anybody say, no, we won't do that.
Okay, I think that's the majority of the questions. Some of them have been answered as we've been going. Does anybody have any questions for Julie? Well, I'd like to mention that Julie and her team reforested a lot of the riparian area at Bristow Battlefield out in Bristow on 619 and 28. And it's an excellent area. There's trails that go through that area. It is an excellent place to see what we're talking about here, what Julie's been about a major reforestation. How many acres, Julie, are we up to there?
We just finished this past fall. In early December, we planted the last 10.2 acres, but we overall in the last 3 years, we've planted 28.7 acres, which is it's our biggest project to date by far. And since you brought that up, Brendan, we are always looking. I'm in the watershed management branch in Prince William County, and we are looking for places to reforest. We do have selection criteria, but one of the subdivisions that we planted it's called Hunter Estates. It's off of Hoadley Road in Prince William County. We planted 10 acres in their common area. And because their HOA president came to a talk like this and was thinking, wow, we could do that on our property. And they were an excellent site. So if you know of an HOA, you've got common area, we can come in there and assess it. We can look at whether or not this would be a good candidate for us to plant, reforest in that area. We are not going on to individual private lots. I'll tell you that right now. If you're hoping we'll come onto your individual lot and do that, we don't do that at this point anyway. But we are looking at both parkland, county-owned land of various kinds, as well as common areas owned by HOAs.
Julie, this
Yes.
is Mike Miller. I keep seeing the cicada question pop up. Do you mind if I answer that real quick for everybody?
No, go right ahead.
So with the emergence coming up, I wouldn't wait to plant there. The cicadas are part of the system every the 17-year emergence coming up this summer. The only real problem that you should see with the cicada emergence on plant damage is what's called obby deposition, and that's planting of eggs. They're not really going to go through and damage your fresh plantings. And that was for Cindy Spees.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, the damage is ovipositing. The females are amazing. They have like a saw-like appendage that they can actually saw into a twig, and when they saw into that twig, they make a little flap, and then they deposit their egg inside that flap. It's enough damage that from the point that they do their ovipositing out to the end of the twig, that usually dies. And so you'll see this coming year, you're going to see mostly mature trees with a lot of brown ends of their branches. And that's where the females have oviposited their eggs. Those branches will drop off with the eggs, go down to the ground. And that's how the eggs of the cicada hatch, and then they burrow down into the ground and will stay there for the next 16 years. Isn't that amazing? It's cool stuff. We did have some damage. If you didn't hear it in the other session we were in, we did plant a young tree. We planted several young serviceberry out at Merrimack Farm Wildlife Management Area. The year, I think it was the same year that the last batch of cicadas came out, and they did damage those young serviceberries, and pretty badly, actually. They struggled on from there. There may have been other reasons why the serviceberries were struggling, but the cicadas definitely did do some damage. So I wouldn't worry about if you're planting any perennials. The adults don't feed. They're not going to chew on anything, but the females will oviposit on twigs of woody plants. And so that's more what you would need to be concerned about.
You're also going to see an emergent of a wasp that's called a cicada killer. Mm-hmm. And these wasps are so big that they can carry these large cicadas, but they will not harm you. So please don't kill those. A lot of landowners are afraid of such large wasps. They got like a 2 centimeter stinger on them. You can literally pick them up and they won't sting you.
And since we have maybe one more minute, I'm just going to note, I see that Missy Kelly is in our audience today, and she was a community leader in her neighborhood who took the lead in getting a portion of their common area reforested. And thank you, Missy, for doing that. It was a pleasure to work with you, and I hope you can inspire a lot of other your neighbors and HOAs to do the same thing.
Well, I know living in Montclair, one of the reasons why we moved here was because of the amount of forested area and tree cover. So it's not a negative to a community to have, a healthy tree stand.
Right. We really need to change how we think about a yard, how we think about a suburban yard. And that whole lawn, I hope most of you got an opportunity when you got your ticket, you should have had a link to 2 different talks by Douglas Tallamy. If you didn't watch those previously, please go back and watch one or the other of them. They're both going to be relatively similar, but he does just an excellent job of communicating how we can be a part of the solution with converting our suburban lawns into very healthy habitat for local wildlife. And trees are certainly a big part of that. So thank you for joining. I just want to say, so good to see everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And we're going to have, when we go back, we're going to go back into the main session. And we're going to hang around for 30 minutes. If you have any other questions, most of the speakers should be there that we can either just chat amongst ourselves or we can tackle some more questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Julie and Brendan.
And I think looks like people are going back. Okay.
Brendan and Julie, how'd your presentation go? I was jumping around between all presentations.
Somebody else is going to have to tell me because I can't say for myself. I had a little trouble initially moving slides, but then I realized that the problem was I couldn't do it with a keyboard. I had to use the mouse. But other than that, it went smoothly. I did have a couple of slides that were really warped.
Yeah, that happened to Laura as well.
Okay. But it was like 2 slides, maybe at most.
Yeah.
All right, I guess we just leave the room, right?
Yes.
Okay. We'll see you back at the main room.